Hi everyone. Today we are going to be discussing Chapter 2 from your textbook, Teaching Elementary Social Studies, Principles and Applications. And we are going to be discussing specifically social studies lessons and unit planning. So before we get started, let's talk about some general guidelines for planning social studies lessons. First off, we need to consider the concept of the lesson. There's a couple different types of lessons that you can do. You can do a whole class lesson. That's where it's teacher directed and it's involving the entire class. And this works for some concepts, but we're going to talk a lot more about lessons designed for small groups and individuals. Lessons should place the teacher in a less central role. You should be more of a facilitator, a tutor, and a provider of resources. I always like to think of us as the facilitators of getting to that objective, not you standing there lecturing at the board. And something that we talked about in your discussion boards that many of you pointed out was the most memorable social studies lessons you had were you doing things, not somebody making you read chapters from a book or listening to a teacher lecture at you all day. So guidelines for effective lessons. The first guideline is you need to decide precisely what we expect our students to do. I always recommend, even if you're not going to be writing that full out 12-page lesson plan that we make you do at Nicholls State, that you still make a list of what you want your students to do during the lesson and decide where, when you're creating those presentations and activities, where you want them to do certain things. So don't assume that you're going to be doing everything at the end because that's kind of boring. You want to try to do things during the lesson. So for example, in your book, one of your teachers, she shows this picture of Buffalo Chase. And she provides this picture on the smartboard, and then she also photocopies it and has her students examine it closely at their desks. And she says, I really want my students to look at the painting closely. So you need to budget time for your students to actually look at the painting. And then she wants them to answer questions about the painting while working in small groups. So you need to think about this. What does the classroom look like? How did you get your students in those small groups? And then what are the specific questions that you want your students to answer about this painting? And she asks some really great questions. She asks about what are these people wearing? How are they hunting these buffalo? What are they doing? What weapons are they using? But then she asks things like, what do you think if you were there in that painting? What would you be hearing? What would it be like? What would you be smelling and seeing? And how do you think this works? And then she's doing this because the objective of the lesson is she wants them to compare and contrast how Native American tribes obtained food, and the specific tribes were these two tribes listed here. Sorry, I have to move myself around. The guideline number 2 for effective lessons is what must the teacher do for a student to achieve what is expected of them? So these are things you need to think about. What materials must you gather? Obviously, you need to find a good picture. You're going to need to photocopy it and get it on the board. How do you need to arrange the class furniture? In the case of in Chapter 2, our teacher had them working in groups, so she probably pre-grouped them with their seating. What must you say and when? And this is the most important one, I think, especially when we're starting out as teacher. What problems should you anticipate? Are you going to have technological problems? Are there going to be students who are going to cut up in class? Are there things that you need to be considerate of because of your students' backgrounds? So those are all things you really need to be thinking about. I think some of our best teachers, they consider what troubleshooting they need to do before they even get to that particular lesson. Then, for us to truly plan a great lesson, we need to write our lesson objectives. So here's the great thing. In Louisiana, our state determines the major objectives you have to meet in each unit. So for example, this is a geography unit. This is standard 2 in the Louisiana State Standards. And then they break down each objective in the unit. So you don't even have to come up with the overall lesson objective, which I think is really nice for teachers. So for example, Standard 2 is for maps, globes, and environment. We want students to develop an understanding of the relationship between people and their physical environment using geographic tools, technology, and map skills. Okay, that's great, but now we need to really break it down into the lesson-specific objectives, which the Louisiana State Standards do for you. So for example, in State Standard 2.21, we want students to be able to locate and identify the poles, equator, continent, oceans, the United States, Louisiana, and their local community. So now you know specifically what you need your students to be able to do during and at the end of that lesson. And you'll notice that these objectives are scaffold. So we're going to learn the basic parts of a map, like the poles and the equator and the continents. Then we're going to start to use titles, keys, and symbols. And then when you get towards the end of the unit, you could be able to identify natural resources and cite ways people conserve, protect, and replenish them. Or you can identify natural disasters and predict where they may occur and explain their effects on people and the environment based on where they're located on a map. So this is a great unit, and this is showing you those sub-objectives for the unit itself. You all should have already been exposed to this over and over again, but I think it's just so important to review. Before you can plan, you need to know what you want to achieve. So Louisiana gives you those sub-objectives, but you then need to break it down into where they will be on Bloom's taxonomy. So, and it's all about the verb. So if you remember Bloom's taxonomy, then we know that we are going to be moving up through levels of thinking. So for example, remembering, understanding, and applying are pretty good, but once you start to get into the creating and evaluating and analyzing, that's a higher level of Bloom's. So for example, in my objective about maps and learning the poles and the equator and the continent, you might have your students remember where poles are and understand what that means and understand what a continent means and be able to identify it. But you could also have your students create a map where they have to provide the poles, and not just like a world map. They can make up their own world or their own country. And then you could have them create their country or their state. It could look like anything. And then they have to show you where the poles are. They have to show you where the equator on that map would be. They would have to create a key for that map. And then they could show you where natural resources are on that map. So there are a lot of different ways to hit on these Bloom's taxonomy. If you're having trouble writing your sub-objectives using Bloom's taxonomy, I highly recommend that you look at this list of verbs. So lower level Bloom's would be your students being able to define key terms, be able to list, recall, underline, or highlight. Whereas when we get up to higher levels of Bloom, that's when they're going to compare and contrast. They're going to categorize. They're going to assemble or construct or create, and then the highest is being able to evaluate. And a great way to evaluate this is to do peer evaluation, but also you could give them other maps and you could have them evaluate the different things about that map and what makes a good map and what doesn't make a good map, which is a great exercise for you to do if you're doing that geography lesson. We're going to talk about two different teaching sequences, one which I'm pretty sure you guys are very familiar with, which is the direct instruction. That's kind of what we do a lot of at Nicholls State. And the other one is concept attainment. So direct instruction, this is a 7-step teaching sequence. It can be applied to almost all subjects. It's great at any grade level, and it was constructed over 30 years ago by a school principal. Concept attainment is used frequently in social studies, and it's very specific to the attainment of concepts. It's found to work best with older children. So I would recommend that if you are writing your lesson plans and you really like this concept attainment model, that you aim more for like third grade or fourth grade and up to use it. And it's best used at the end of a unit. So it's best used towards those lessons towards the end of the unit where your students have already mastered vocabulary and the very basic knowledge that they would need for concept attainment. And concept attainment is 3 phases, each with 3 parts. So let's get started with discussing each one. The first one we're going to talk about is direct instruction. And this one I know you all are very familiar with. So the first thing you want to do is you want to create like an anticipatory set. This is where you're going to get your juices flowing by thinking about a concept or topic. A lot of elementary school teachers use bell ringers for this. So they might ask you when you get into class, tell me everything you know about maps. Or can you identify different things on this map? Or what is this? And show a map. Then you're going to state the objective and purpose of the lesson. So you're going to tell your students why. I am one of those few professors who cannot stand the I can statement. And the reason why I don't like the I can statement is it doesn't give relevance to the student. So I always say, I get that you have to state your objective and purpose, but consider changing that I can statement to something that is much more relevant to the student's life. So instead of saying like, I can find how to get from point A to point B on a map, you could state, I can find where my house is on a map, or I can find out how to give directions from my school to my house. And then the students are going to be a lot more tuned in to wanting to learn that concept. Then you're going to do input. This is where students are going to acquire information from reading, from listening to you, from watching a video, to looking at a specimen or a picture. And then you're going to model. Someone shows students what they will be doing. It's that I do, you watch, we do, then you do type of thing. Then you're going to check for understanding. This could be through any type of assessment. It could be thumbs up, thumbs down. It could be you giving a worksheet, a little Kahoot quiz, a think, pair, share. It could be any of those types of things. And then you're going to provide guided practice where the students work while you, the teacher, circulate. It could be group work or individual. And then there would be independent practice, time when students can complete the task without the help from a teacher or a peer. That could be homework or could be due during class time. This is pretty much how we teach a lot of subjects in elementary school. The other way that we teach is through concept attainment model, and this one is a little bit trickier. It's 3 phases, and in class we're going to watch this YouTube video, but feel free to watch it on your own. And it's phase 1, it starts like a game. Your teacher presents students with examples and non-examples of a concept. So in class today, we're going to be discussing what makes something living and what makes something not living. So I'm going to present to you a bunch of examples. I'm going to say what is living and what is not living. And I'm going to encourage you all to compare, for examples, to non-examples and ask what's different. So what's different between a rock and a flower? What's the difference between a seed and a feather? What's the difference between a cell and a molecule? And then we're going to have students be ready to state a definition for a concept or a hypothesis. So I'm going to ask you, okay, so what are you guys saying? You're saying that something that is living has to be able to move? And like, I'll write this down on a sheet. You guys are going to see me model this in class today. Then I'm going to present examples of the concept, not labeled, and students determine what is and what is not an example of the concept based on your original definition. So if we originally defined that all living things have to be able to move, then I might show you a picture of a car moving and say, is this living? And then I might show you a rock rolling down a hill and say, is this living? And then teachers are going to reiterate the definitions and the hypothesis that you all produced. Then we're going to start to refine, right? Then you're going to go, wait. No. There are things that are alive that don't move, and there are things that are not alive that do move. So then we're going to have to refine our definition of a concept, like what makes something living and what makes something non-living. And then at the end, we're going to describe how did we reach this conclusion? And you're going to talk about how you changed your definition and why and how did the definition change. And then we're going to discuss how we would continue to test this concept. Now you see why you need to have a little bit of an older student to be able to do this. But like, what a beautiful way to teach something. It's also very challenging. So your students are going to like really think about it and it's going to stick with it. I really love if you teach civics that this could be before you teach what a law is and how we get to laws, asking your students what they think a law is compared to a rule. And then we can compare it. You know, you could ask your students, well, do you go to jail for breaking rules? Do you go to jail for breaking laws? Who makes laws? Who makes rules? And it's a great way to get your students to start to figure out the concept on their own based on all the information you presented in prior lessons. So I definitely think it's something that you should try with your students. I think it's a great way to really get the students to use inquiry-based learning to learn a concept. There are 6 principles to planning instructional units. 1, plan units using the principles of backwards design. If you're not familiar with backwards design, I'm going to introduce a little bit of that, and we can go in much more depth in class if you don't understand it. You need your units to be integrated. So what does that mean? That means your lessons need to build on each other. Your units should be in a certain order that makes sense. So if we're learning history, we should probably be starting at the very beginning of a time period and working our way towards the current time. The scope of each unit should be clearly defined. Breadth versus depth. You all discussed this in our discussion boards this past week about those principles of teaching and learning, and many of you discussed that you really want your students to focus on these big chunks and concepts, but you don't want them spending so much time on minute details. And I thought that was so awesome. So we can't expect students to memorize everything and regurgitate it on a test. We can't expect them to have 5 chapters on a test. We can't expect students to learn every minute detail of a historical event. We do need them to understand the significance of the event and the who, what, where, when, and why of that event, but they don't need to know like what that person ate for breakfast that morning when that historical event occurred. Activities in a unit should follow a logical sequence. Scaffold, scaffold, scaffold. If you expect your students to create a timeline of a historical event, they need to learn how to make a timeline first. Same thing with that concept attainment map. You're going to have to build their skill level up so that they'll be able to do that. Units should provide a variety of instructional resources. Please do not only use YouTube videos. Do not only use reading from the textbook. You can use plays about historical figures and events that you have students read and act out. You can use documentaries. You can use pictures, photographs, or paintings from historical events. You could bring in items and say, you know, like, this is how people used to wash clothes, and bring in a tub and a washboard and ask them, like, what needed to happen to have the modern day washing machine. There's so many different resources that you can use in educational technologies that you don't have to have your students get bored to death doing the same reading and filling out a worksheet, reading and filling out a worksheet. And then units should include whole class, group, small group, and individual activities. So not every lesson needs to hit that, but if you're planning a unit, consider, you know, those introductory lessons might be whole class, and group activities. And then when you're getting into the much higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, that might be when you're doing more individual or partner type activities. Like from the beginning of this lecture, when I mentioned students creating a map of their own country, that might be a more individual type of lesson versus when all students need to learn where the poles, the equator, and a map key are. So if you're not familiar with backwards design, it's 3 stages. And I think a lot of times we get so hung up on the activities that we don't do backwards design. And I highly recommend it, particularly for science, that we always follow backwards design. So stage 1 of backwards design, you must decide and define what social studies standard or standards the unit will address. So what are your objectives? And that's great and easy because Louisiana gives you those standards. Then, rather than start picking the activities to meet those objectives, you need to decide how are you going to measure these objectives? What type of assessments and evidence are you going to collect to determine that your students have achieved that objective? For your older students, that might be quizzes, that might be tests. For your younger students, it might be some sort of worksheet and activity throughout the lesson. And then finally, you are going to create your learning plan. So this is when the teacher is going to create the learning experience to achieve those objectives that can be assessed. Activities should really hook and hold a student's interest. Don't do an activity to do an activity. It must meet that objective. It needs to be measurable, and it needs to be interesting. Nobody wants to fill out packets of worksheets every day. And I think we all can agree to that. It also needs to meet our students' differences in abilities. So what else should we know about social studies units? Activities and units should follow a logical sequence. I've said this a couple times now. You'll have introductory activities versus a cumulative activity or capstone at the end of the unit. My personal recommendation is start with a whole group, then start working towards smaller groups, and then maybe individuals, and then individuals can present to the whole group at the end of that lesson or unit. Everything should be integrated. A unit should go beyond history and geography to include other skills and technologies. You can incorporate ELA, you can incorporate music, you can incorporate art, you can incorporate science, you can incorporate math depending on the unit. So sometimes it's really helpful because if you can align your social studies units to meet what you're doing in ELA or in science, you can really connect the 2 subjects and give them both the amount of time that they need. Some other helpful tips, you can always use things like the KWL chart to find out what your students know. If you're not familiar with the KWL chart, it's students can list what they already know about a topic. You can ask them what they wonder about, and then at the end of the unit or the lesson, you can ask them what they learned. It's a great assessment. I like to do this with open-ended prompts where they have to describe what they already know about a topic, or you could give a short reading and have them reflect with their own knowledge and events, or show them a picture. Discussion should be informal on the first day, just to allow you to figure out, like, are there misconceptions coming from your students? Like sometimes I say things like, what comes to mind when you think of Neil Armstrong or George Washington Carver? And some students might have some great ideas and others might be like, I have no idea. And that helps me understand where my students are at. Other best practices include at the beginning of the unit, you really do need to establish a time and a place. So you need to show them where we are at in history, where we are at in the world, what is happening during this time, so that you're not just teaching like the Declaration of Independence in this bubble, but your students understand what is happening while this document is being written and why is it being written. I like to show video clips or have students read assigned chapters. sometimes. I also love showing them great pictures about what's happening during that time period. Let them see the clothes, if the pictures are black and white, if they have to be painted. That really gives your students a good idea of what is happening in the world during this time. At the middle of the unit, I like to do a lot of small group and individual work. That gives students some freedom to pursue their interests. So for example, I'm showing you the Louisiana commodity map. If we were discussing the state of Louisiana, I could say, okay, I want you to pick a commodity. It could be strawberries, it could be crawfish, it could be cows. I want you to pick that. And I want you to look at Louisiana in this map, and I want you to tell me where you're seeing people farm for these different commodities and why you think they are farmed in these regions, right? And let that student do the research on that. And then at the end of the unit, you can segue activities and wrap up one unit to move to the next. So you can show relationships between units. So for example, if students are learning about Louisiana as a state and they want to understand their natural resources, and that's where we're wrapping up, then we might get into an economics unit where we're going to talk a little bit about how these different commodities and natural resources affect Louisiana's economy. And then again, wrap up activities could be acting out an event, playing games, presenting your information, presenting primary literature you found, like diary entries, other things like that. So what are we doing today? Today, you all chose a social studies standard, either because you're about to teach it or it's a social studies standard that interests you. And we're going to go to the Smithsonian websites and we're going to write a lesson plan using any information available on the site. So first, we need to answer the 2 questions that all teachers must resolve before they plan a lesson. What is it you, the teacher, expect the students to do? So what's your objective? And then what must you, the teacher, do in order for your students to be able to achieve what you expect them to do? So what assessments are you going to provide them? What activities are you going to provide them so that they can learn this objective? And so I'm giving you a template for this. It is not the like Nicholls State lesson plan template. It's a very short one. But what you'll see is we can continue to expand this lesson and make it into one of your final lessons for this course. So thank you all so much. This is your format in case you're interested, which I will present to you in class. And then this is how I will grade you. Thank you all so much, and I will see you all today for a great lecture, and we're going to work on our Smithsonian lesson plans together.